Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Slavery Archive Book Club. Today, we're very happy to welcome Gabriel Foreman and Jim Casey to present to us uh, their collected volume. They co-edited with Sarah Patterson, Color Convention Movement. I'm going to introduce them in a second. But first, I wanted to make sure that I acknowledge our co-hosts. Who are, some of them are here. We have Ana Lucia Araujo. She's not going to be sharing her video with us today. She is at Howard University. It's Jessica Marie Johnson, who is at Johns Hopkins, and Vanessa Holden, who couldn't make it today, co-hosts with us, and she's at the University of Kentucky. And all right, so let me introduce you to today's authors, who I'm so excited to have them here today. And Dr. Gabriel Foreman is the founding director of the Color Conventions Project, as an award-winning professor of English, African American Studies and History, and the Paterno Family Professor of American Literature and Professor of American Studies and History at Penn State University. She is the author of Activist Sentiments, Reading Black Women in the 19th Century, University of Illinois Press in 2009, and she has been working for many, many years as an editor of imported Black authors, Black women authors, including her edition of Arneg by Harriet Wilson, and the collected works of Maggie Shaw Fully-Love and Marietta Spencer. And I could say more because Gabrielle, of course, has had a long and rich trajectory. And Jim Casey is an assistant professor of African American Studies, History and English at Penn State, where he serves as managing director of the Center for Black Digital Research. He earned his PhD in English from the University of Delaware and held a postdoctoral fellowship at the Center for Digital Humanities at Princeton University, our friends over there across the pond. He co-directs the Colored Conventions Project and Douglas Day. And is working on a book about the history of editors and collaborations in the Black and mass market presses of the 19th century United States. He has work published or soon to appear in American periodicals, Civil War history, and American literature. So please join me in welcoming them. Before I pass the mic to them, I wanted to make a little comment about how we're going to do questions and answers. As you're thinking of questions, feel free to write them in the chat. Once Jim and Gabrielle are done presenting, then we will go to the question and answer session. You can raise your hand. If you feel more comfortable with us reading your questions, we'll be happy to read them from the chat. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Gabrielle and Jim to present to us the Colored Conventions Movement edited volume. Yes.
Oh, there goes my light. I'm going to pick it up. Hold on 1 minute, guys. Apology. It is so good to be here. I usually work from PowerPoint and not from Google Slides. So if someone could just tell me very quickly, how do I get to this being on the whole screen rather than showing view?
I think you press present.
I got it. Thank you so much. We're delighted to be here, not only with these formidable and prize-winning scholars and fellow public thinkers and creatives who gather us together for these meetings, but also with all of you who took the time to clear your schedules and come today, or who are coming later on YouTube in the many moments that will follow our discussion today. I have been that person over many meals, watching Slavery Archive book club. And so we just want to honor the very precious time that people are taking to gather here together. The Color Conventions Project advances collectivity, and this is one reason we wanted to start with this slide, because we're representatives of the work that is being done collectively to honor the collective work that was done in the convention movement itself. Thinking about collectivity is one way to understand not only early Black organizing as an example, but also as a historical foundation. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. The movement this book addresses and that coloredconventions.org explores in its digital exhibits and its proceedings and minutes and the work we do at the Center for Black Digital Research, which Jim and I and Shirley Moody Turner co-direct with more than 30 people who are leaders of various parts of that project. Color Convention, as one of those, the book and the site, document the work that took place over 7 decades of Black collective organizing. And here are our teaching partners as well. So when we talk about collectives, we're meaning not only the people on the ground at Penn State, but the many contributors, the volunteers, the national teaching partners, the community arts partners who are doing this work together to document and examine and understand a movement which itself was collective. The Color Convention project took place over, the Color Conventions movement took place over 7 decades of Black collective organizing. That's half a century plus 20 additional years. 7 decades now rolls off my tongue as if I don't understand that it's a lifetime, right? That it's more than many of our ancestors' lifetimes, the work that it takes to sustain that kind of organizational energy over that many decades is something that I think we should pause on for at least a moment. Douglas's first convention was 2 years before his narrative was published when he was in his mid-20s. John Mercer Langston was a teenager at his first convention. And they go on until they're wizened activists, old, gray. We've seen those photos of Douglas as he progresses, right? And so much of that photographic work and documentary efforts, they were both involved for over 40 years. When we pan out that sustained labor and networks of Black influence, Black involvement, and Black advocacy, it's foundational activism. This is the first full-length book on the movement in 50 years, and it's the second full-length book, period. It's the first edited collection on this Black-led movement that included more than 10,000 delegates and tens of thousands of participants. And that asks us to grapple with the long history of collective advocacy as a legacy, writing in committees and collectives over the sole and exceptional model of authorship, which we've inherited, the paradigm of the slave narrative as foundational to Black writing. What does it mean when we think about the addresses, the oratory, the work, the committee work that went into collective authorship as a model that tens of thousands of leaders thousands of leaders, hundreds and thousands of leaders were included in as part of a practice sustained over time? What does that mean as a different kind of foundation for thinking about not individual rights, but collective rights, not individual authorship, but collective authorship, not individual subjectivity, but community subjectivity, is one of the questions that I think this movement brings to the fore in very significant ways. And this is true as we think about breathing life as a people into models of democracy, whatever that comes to mean and has meant in these Americas, in these disquieted states of America. It invites us to think, as many of us have already, about what it means for this book to hold so many places as a first when we survey the many volumes of anti-slavery, on abolition, on the interracial movement that is both overshadowed and in complicated ways helped to preserve a movement which predates antebellum abolition, predates the founding of the New England and American Anti-Slavery Society by several years, and then continued on for an additional 35 years after the 13th Amendment was passed. Why, as many of you have heard me ask before, do we continue to call Henry Highland Garnett and Mary Ann Shag Carey and Francis E.W. Harper and John Mercer Langston and 1,000 more abolitionists when for decades after the passage of the 13th Amendment, again, they collectively stood not against slavery, but for liberation, for Black educational access and justice, labor rights, voting and jury rights, and criminal justice reform, for freedom from state-sanctioned violence as shared objectives for Black dignity, agreeing that conventions were part of a strategy for justice and debating tactics in ways that reveal so much about the legacy of activism that we inherit. This new volume's readable essays dive deep into those 7 decades, mining multiple sources to suss out the role of women who were largely left out of the convention records, and exploring the debates, tactics, institutional outgrowths, relationships, and networks that emerge for a Black-led movement that involved, again, hundreds and hundreds of towns, of cities, of churches, of meeting halls that spawned colleges like Talladega College and Florida A&M, that spawned educational drives and newspapers, and at which thousands of speeches moved tens of thousands of attendees and readers. It includes pieces such as Erica Ball's fine essay on the oratory and civic performances of the conventions, what in a wonderful digital exhibit that accompanies it, we echo her in calling the conventions of the conventions. And essays like the ground shifting piece by Psyche Forson Williams called What Did They Eat, Where Did They Stay?, which asks us to think beyond just the podium and the pews, but to the boarding houses, to think about the infrastructure that was necessary and the fundraising that was necessary that women did in order, and children were involved in order to house these multi-day meetings in hundreds of cities and towns and hamlets across North America. What of these women and children, the infrastructure builders and funders who made these buildings, these meetings collectively possible? What can we say about what they built and belong to? It's that collectivity that brings us back to appreciation for what Slaveryarchive Book Club does and what each of these scholars do, why it's so important to have siblings to build with and be pushed by for inspiration and accountability. And so I want to say what I think many of us have said in this place before, how blessed and grateful we are to exist in time and place alongside Dr. Johnson's scholarship and public work from African diaspora PhD to her LifeX Code and beyond, alongside Alex Gill's Torn Apart Separados, his Puerto Rican Mapathon for hurricane relief, to Archipelagos, a Journal of Caribbean digital praxis, to the work of Ana Lucia Arajo's work on the international scientific community of UNESCO's Slave Route Project. Collectives are important inside the work we do. Collectives are important within the work we do, through and beyond the work we do. We are part of a larger sibling diaspora of work that can only be done collectively. And so we just wanted to acknowledge and thank you for that work today. We are so often talking, it seems to me, at a moment when Black people, almost all Black people, feel like we can suddenly be under threat when we move into public spaces, when we travel. Black mobility is a space that can be challenged, surveilled, and transformed into a deadly encounter at almost any time. And this is one thing that having meetings across the entire North America, moving into the Caribbean, right? Thinking through the movement of the delegates through the Caribbean and into North America, continuous movement brings to us. Encounters with atmospheric environments, from Katrina to Maria to Ida, to infectious environments, from Philadelphia's yellow fever to COVID-19. There is a through line from the conventions when Henry McNeil Turner testified that delegates traveled under cover of night to avoid violence, or when Frederick Douglass and Francis and Sidney Abner went to confront a railway agent for policies that were often initiated when private citizens decided they were uncomfortable with sharing space with African Americans. and called on agents of the state for the enforcement of their will. I mean, one thing that emerges, oh, I missed all the slides because these are the abolitionists for the moment when I was talking about abolitionists and the images that we generally see. Robert Purvis over there, right? I love, this is a collective petition. We're about to go after petitions. We've got many of the proceedings, we've grown them from 12 national conventions and 43 state conventions to over 200 proceedings with exhibits and maps and digital proceedings, but we're going for petitions next. So if anybody in the audience is interested, particularly in political petitions, please let us know. We'll be doing that work. This is one of the early ones signed by Charles Langston. But this is where I wanted to go. I mean, one thing that emerges from grappling with the fact that our editors, organizers, and educators have been advocating for so long for our rights, well beyond the time that many of us knew when we began our careers, just for basic decency from our democracy, is that for me tonight, I am tired. I'm tired of the advocating for the things that we should take for granted. I'm tired from doing it when the state doesn't care about our lives. I'm tired of doing it in the confrontational spaces of Karen. I'm tired, but we're not singular folks dealing with singular pronouns. And this is the iconic image that we often get from the March on Washington. And this is the one I think we need to focus on, is that I will always be tired. I, the singular person, will always be tired. But us and we and ours, this we mean, the panning out from the singular pronoun to the plural one in this image, where liberty, not anti anything, but liberation for all of us is our goal, means that we work on it together and we float with each other in these moments of fatigue. So I wanted to leave us with this image as I move over to Jim, and I'm going to stop sharing here, Jim, so that you can pick it up, and I'll go on mute.
All right, thank you. Extra special thank you to Alex, Gabrielle, everybody who just helped me connect. I'm on a, I think, 9-year-old computer, so if I disappear, we'll keep our fingers crossed. I'm going to click share. Hopefully that's displaying a slide that everybody can see. And what I want to do in just a few minutes is to a little bit extend and augment Gabrielle's comments, a little bit to reflect on the digital project that actually preceded this book that you're reading. There was a huge amount of people. I don't even know that we have a photo of half of the people at this point who have worked on a big class photo, of all the people who have worked on this project over the years. But it's an important story, one that we want to share a little bit with you, because I think it speaks to some of the sort of particular threads that connect our collective today, studying some of these collectives and organizing circuits back in the day. So let me show you real quick. This is just a screenshot of what you can find at colorconventions.org. We have been stacking up PDFs with some metadata since 2012, the spring of 2012. When we first began, we had access to a couple of reprint volumes, Arno Press from Temple Press from the 1960s and 70s. As Gabrielle mentioned, we had about 65 of these state and national conventions. They were really hard to find. If you could find any of them, I don't know, it was like buying Bitcoin sometimes, it felt like. But as we started to gather more and more of these, and did even just a little bit of research in those early days, we began to realize that we weren't just scratching the surface of a small, kind of interesting antebellum movement, but one that was really much, much larger and more complicated than really any of us had begun to recognize. We started meeting together weekly with our collectives, with food, in dimly lit classrooms through 2012, 2013. Now Dr. Sarah Patterson introduced the exhibits and storytelling into our ecosystem. Many other folks joined to do graphic design, to do outreach. Denise Berger joined us in 2014 when we began to launch our transcribed minutes, our crowdsourcing effort that we ran in concert with the National AME Church lay leadership. And as all of this was going on, there was a small but sturdy crew in the background constantly growing our collection, reaching out to the now more than 100 libraries, archives, and repositories that hold records of the color conventions. This was such a mass movement that part of its invisibility has just been the sheer legibility, the sheer difficulty of just being able to read even a tiny fraction of the materials that we would have been able to find here. And we say that not to be hyperbolic, but to show that when we began, we had a time that looked something like this, as Gabrielle mentioned. It was a sort of all too easily dismissed stepchild of the antebellum movement that we really hadn't begun to recognize. And when we started to do more and more digging, we realized that the timeline actually looked something more like this. When we thought there were 65, and then we thought there were 75, and that number kept growing. There's a couple hundred now on our site. There's probably another 600 or so out there in the ether that we're working hard on. We've got a lot of years left to go. And it's a really expansive history. In part, I mentioned this to show, for example, this map that you see here of the places where delegates lived and the places that they traveled to attend these meetings. This is an expansive convention. This wasn't even an outdated map. Now I think we can say with confidence that almost every single state up to 1900 sent delegates to at least some of the conventions, and many of them hosted it in vast majority. And so this book for us really emerged out of a conversation around growing this collection, around trying to understand what it meant to think together about these expansive collectives that were not just sort of isolated one-off experiences, not just the New York crowd or the Philadelphians or people in the Reconstruction South having conventions here and there, but really part of a much larger movement that's not a linear sort of civil rights sort of directed movement. We're sort of point A to point B, but a really emergent sort of expansive network that really grew in ways that I think we're still coming to understand. Some of the work that I've even done with, if you made it that deep into the book before today, emerged out of wanting to try and understand some of the social networks, to understand both what the communities were in the early stages, but how those evolved and grew, and who the people were that helped to draw threads between lots of different kinds of communities. And so as we began to sort of develop a little bit of data and a little bit of records and some metadata that we slowly were able to work with our librarian partners, Carol Rudisell, especially we should name Dr. Curtis Small, excuse me. We began to also develop things like an index, things where we could start to be able to look forward to places where we could track some of those names, where we could start to develop information that would help to really open up this all of a sudden huge collection of materials. And that made a couple of things very obvious to us. First, there were some really important people who now feel like long lost cousins to those of us who've been studying these things. But certainly we're not, I think, huge on anybody's radar, but those of us who have done lots of research in the period. Names like the Langstons that we mentioned before, George Downing, Amos Beeman, right? Tons and tons of these people, but also women like Marion Shedd Carey, Mary Bibb, Harriet Myers, all these kind of other people whose names very, very rarely appeared in the minutes. In fact, when we had built a data set that felt kind of complete with the minutes that we had, we did the math and found that about 99.5% of the names were probably people that we could understand as being men. And so we had to put in protocols. Through the work of Sarah Patterson and Gabrielle and other folks, we started to sign MOUs that you can find on our site that asked our teaching partners to commit to always assigning not just the men who appeared at the podium, but also associated women who were part of that work. And that's been such a huge regenerative strand of scholarship because we've just learned so much, and it's not like it wasn't there. It's not like we couldn't go out and find it. It was really about putting those protocols together. I'm very pleased to happy to share. You guys, I think today are the very first to actually see this. We've been meaning to do this for years, and finally just somehow the tides aligned in the proper way. We've now posted all of our collection of mentions of people that we think might be women, mostly Black women, as far as we know. You can now find that on our site, omeka.colorconventions.org/women. It's free to search. We'd love to talk more. We're sharing that in the spirit of laying out a feast and a buffet for everybody to join us with. And so I want to close a little bit just by looking forward. It's a big, long book. If you had a chance to sit down with it, at times it felt like it was a never-ending project, in part because there's still so much of this history left for us to contend with. And so just as a few quick notes, looking ahead, I wanted to share just two key sort of points that I think are going to characterize a lot of the work that we have ahead of us. The first is, and I won't read the quote, is a, let's call it surreptitiously declared self-anointed committee that Marion Carey led at this huge, what some called the first nationwide convention in 1869 in Washington, D.C., where she stands up in the middle of the proceedings and more or less unilaterally declares that colored women be cordially invited in the invitation to further and organize cooperative societies, and sort of pushes at the sort of directions of the conventions to think more in concert with women's organization and activism in the different ways that auxiliaries and circuits extended well beyond the conventions, but then fed back into them in ways that the documents themselves don't always just reveal to us. And I'd really encourage you to go and read that. There's a much longer passage to be had there. The second part that we're looking forward to is much later in the Reconstruction period, where you might have noticed the book sort of trails off a little bit until we get to Dr. Johnson's great work in the 1890s. One of the things that we've been able to learn about is the huge upswing in the conventions that had more or less gone dormant or shifted forms in the late Reconstruction period that really jump off in 1883, when there are nationwide conventions surrounding the 1883 National Color Convention, at which Frederick Douglass gives a speech that we've now come to call Why Hold a Color Convention? And we were incredibly lucky to work with some of our talented collaborators and the talented actor Hassan El Amin to do a dramatic reading of the 1883 speech. It's also on YouTube. Next time you're washing dishes or looking for something fun to watch, we really encourage you to go watch it. And I'll skip through because I know we're running late on time here. In absolutely no relation at all to any of the critical race theory nonsense bills in the news lately, I just wanted to share just a brief passage from the speech where he says, and he's sort of speaking in a kind of ironic tone, what more can the colored people of this country want than they now have, and what more is possible to them? And he goes on to ask, why then do they hold color conventions and thus insist upon keeping up the color line? And of course, Douglas has lots to say, and he responds, no reasonable man will ever object to white men holding conventions in their own interests when they are once in our condition and we in theirs, when they are the oppressees and we are the oppressors. In point of fact, white men are already in convention against us in various ways, and at many important points, the practical construction of American life is a convention against us. So we've got lots of this left to learn, and we're going to look forward to your questions and conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jim and Gabrielle. That was phenomenal. And thank you for sharing the new link with us first. I asked if you're ready for us to share online. I would be happy to tweet it later. All right, so this is the part where we're going to encourage you to raise your hand or ask a question in the chat. This is why we're here. We're here to have a rich conversation with the editors of this and authors in this fantastic volume. So I already see there's one quick question already in the chat, and I'm just gonna go ahead. Or Jessica, are you? Do you want to ask the questions in the chat?
Sure. There's a question from Nancy Lewis. Nancy, do you want me to read it, or I can have you on screen and you can read it yourself or ask it yourself?
No, thanks. You can go ahead and read it. That's fine.
Okay. All right. So Nancy Lewis asks, I always marvel how people communicated their activism prior to our technological advances. Was it primarily through letter writing or printed notices? Thank you all for your scholarship.
I'll start that, and then Jim can jump in and talk a little more about Black newspapers. So there were calls put out, and Carla Peterson's essay in this volume is really fantastic at laying out the importance of thinking through the calls that were notices that were put in newspapers. They were read from church podiums. There were municipal meetings that led to state meetings, and that where delegates were actually chosen. And then there was always a role of the delegates at each of the convention meetings. So there was a whole, again, infrastructure that was put in place, a process that was put in place, but the debates also took place in the newspapers. And this becomes really important because the newspaper debates extend the audience beyond the people who were in the room at the convention themselves. We should say something about the structure of the conventions and why this is important in relationship to questions of temporality and organizing. But we think about a timeline of convention, or some people think about the timeline of convention as literally the dates during which it was held. But when we think about it in relationship to the movement, the mobility of people who needed to go there, we come up with different analytical frames, different kinds of questions again. When we think about where it happened, and not only as the buildings, which are the names that are in the proceedings themselves, but again, the boarding houses or the trains as vehicles of activism, of vehicles of experience that generated the kind of work that was happening and debates that were happening at the conventions themselves, we run into, again, a different kind of temporality. The proceedings were meant to be printed out, and there were always committees that were going to print the proceedings themselves as a way to extend the reach of the conventions and of the initiatives, of the advocacy, of the laws that were being challenged, or the educational initiatives of the newspapers that were being trying to be founded that came out of the conventions. They were captured in the proceedings, but sometimes you would have them actually wait until they printed it so that the newspaper coverage could be generated before the next kind of hit, as it were, right? To extend the length and the conversational reach of the conventions. This is important when we're thinking about gender. It's important when we're thinking about representation and leadership, who goes versus who's involved, right, in the actualization of the work when it migrates back to the sites from which delegates came. All of these different frames allow us to think about temporal contours, and frames allow us to think differently about audience, about organizing, about strategy, and about frames of analysis. Jim, do you want to talk a little bit about the newspapers themselves and how they're institutionally interdependent, or about anything else?
Sure. Yeah, I think that the sort of major upshot for me is that I think we have to just read the convention minutes and official proceedings as basically newspapers unto themselves. When we first began, and we could get really into the data parts, but we really thought pretty naively about what the print record was going to be. There was a convention, and they would put out a document, and then that would sort of be all we would sort of be able to figure out. And of course that wasn't true, but you know, past selves. And we are increasingly sort of thinking about these documents as sort of collectively written, right? We see a lot of the conventions would spend a lot of time debating the exact wording of a resolution or a committee or a report of some particular kind. And sometimes they would have real disagreements, right? The most famous, I think, sort of debate that comes out of the early conventions in 1843, when Henry Highland Garnet stands up and gives a speech in which he more or less encourages folks to, you know, fight or die. And people try to refer it to a kind of revise and resubmit process. They say, let's put it in committee and we'll take out some of the harsher language. And he really sort of stands up and says, no, and I don't want to let this document be taken. And so we don't actually have the original documents because the conventions never voted to include it in the actual official published proceedings. And that's because some people sort of point to Douglas and the sort of usual sort of, you know, famous, you know, two guys arguing with each other. But when we actually look at the documents, we realize that there were a bunch of people who were working as newspaper editors in Southern Ohio or Philadelphia who said, I'm not sure I'm willing to put my name to a document like that living where I live. And I'm going to think more about the circulation of these materials beyond just the convention. And we see that across so many of the different published proceedings where they really were thinking about how these would circulate and who they would go to. We see even kind of gift copies into the Reconstruction period where they would send specific sort of versions of the pamphlets to people. On an organizational level, it's hard to sort of know where the newspapers and the Black press starts and the conventions begin because they were so wrapped up. Conventions would take up a collection of money and then start a newspaper the next year. Or a newspaper would say, I think we should have a convention to talk about some of these problems that are facing our community, but also lots of other Black communities. Therefore, let's have a convention. And so it becomes this real kind of symbiotic relationship where, and I could talk forever about this, but I'll just sort of end by saying where we see sort of common sort of approaches to organizing, to sort of community formation, both in the newspapers and in the conventions feeding into each other. And I won't even gesture towards the period immediately after the Civil War, when we have more conventions in 2 years than the entire antebellum period. Perhaps not small gap that you might notice in the index and table of contents to a volume near you. So there's tons of sort of opportunities because so many of those conventions went out and started newspapers specifically because they wanted to compete in the constitutional conventions that were happening at that moment. It's a kind of wild read for a lot of those conventions because they were held in the state houses, in the main squares. These were not kind of marginalized off to the side meetings. I think I'll leave it there because there's so much more to say.
We have another question from the chat, Jessica.
Yes, we have Richard White, and he said I could ask this, said, could these conversations be considered informal, non-governmental governance vehicle for those free and enslaved? And I see Gabrielle already shaking her head.
Are far from informal. So one of the things that is, I call these parallel politics. They face a little bit about what they lead to as well. These are extraordinarily formal meetings with, and there's a wonderful exhibit, again, Erica Ball's Convention to Conventions, which includes all of the rule books, like the 19th century Robert Rules of Order. One is Jefferson's, I'm forgetting what they're called, but the one that is penned by Thomas Jefferson, but literally the Robert Rules of Order of their day that are used in the conventions themselves. Now, when we get to the postbellum moment, it is really interesting to see the ways in which in New Orleans, and Mark Rudinay's great-grandfather or great-great-grandfather is the person in the New Orleans newspapers who printed this, and he's in the room today with us and has a wonderful book on that work as well. The people in New Orleans who are and beyond who are suggesting in the postbellum conventions, hey, this is a real way to keep the newly freed and the unlettered from participating in the conventions as equals. So this is certainly contested, but these are multi-day meetings with extraordinarily formal structures that are replicated over and over again as formal structures in order to perform the citizenship and inclusion and debate and reasoned oratory and in ways that are recognizable to the larger context of 19th century activism itself. I need to remove the spotlight. I'm just looking at myself and it's freaking me out. So these are formal structures. Now, it's also formal structures that see themselves in conversation with both African-American institutions and with institutions that are functioning in exclusionary ways. So that you see, for example, conventions moving to the winter. And you think, like, why would they hold a meeting in January, right? Like, because it's hard to travel, right? You know, hundreds of miles in the middle of winter, and they're doing it because the legislature from the state in which they're meeting is holding sessions, formal sessions at the same time, right? So that they want the coverage of the newspaper coverage, and the people who are empowered to be in the city at the same time to assure the kind of overlap and influence of the convention. And then I should say that so many of the people who were delegates, official delegates, go on to participate in state constitutional conventions and in state legislatures as national statesmen. So, for example, John Mercer Langston becomes the first congressman in the House of Representatives, and he, went to his first convention when he was 19 from the state of Virginia. And this is after he has been the inaugural law dean at Howard Law School, where Anna teaches. So, well, not the law school, but as a historian. So you see this kind of movement from the formal structures of the Black conventions through and between other formal structures, both formal structures in Black communities, like editors of Black newspapers, bishops in the AME church, et cetera, but also in constitutional conventions as delegates, and then in the post-felon period as state legislatures throughout the South, for example. Jim, you want to jump in, and you go next time. Next time.
I'll be quick. I mean, the only other thing to add is that many of the conventions elected local representatives. That there was a deliberate attempt, a need, and priority to demonstrate what democratic practice looked like in places like North Carolina, Georgia, Texas, Tennessee, where people would have local town neighborhood meetings and elect the delegate who would go to the state convention. If there was a national convention, then the state convention would elect the delegate to go to the national convention. And that meant that there was accountability. There were conventions that got together at the state level in Arkansas, for example, in the early 1880s, who decided, we're actually gonna sort of decide not to attend the national convention this year. We're trying to sort of play politics at the local level. We're trying to sort of, I don't know how we say that diplomatically, how to sort of, judge around and swerve around the sort of early days of Jim Crow politics and lynchings at the same time when people are in the State House demanding Black voting rights. People were really bold at times and people were strategic and diplomatic at times. And both of those were involved in the voting practices around the conventions in ways that I think we have a lot to sort of learn and study from.
All right. Do we have, if you have any questions, please raise your hand. Do we have?
Raise your hand.
No, why do I have echo? Hold on.
Oh, why do I have echo?
Are you hearing echo for me too?
Are you hearing echo for me too?
Oh.
Yes.
I fixed you, I think. Go ahead. Keep rolling.
Yeah, I'm gonna keep it rolling. All right. So
Okay, there is a question coming from Natalie.
yes.
Thank
there
you.
is.
Thank you, Anna.
Okay.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone. This was a fascinating, this was a fascinating collection of essays to read. I especially appreciated the ways that women's invisible labor was brought to the forefront, and it makes a really nice bridge between the work that Keisha Blaine has on Black nationalists a couple of decades after. So I really appreciated that connection. But my question specifically has to do with the food interactions. I enjoyed that chapter, and I found that argument about food being one of the most important investments, in people's lives. And I just wanted some more elaboration. So when you all are looking at these convention proceedings, what does the food tell you about the class orientation of folks? What types of statements are the food making specifically? I was just really curious about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie.
Jim, do you want to jump in for Psyche, or how do you want to?
I was just going to try and Google it real quick. There's a full exhibit about this question on our website by some graduate students whose names I'm blanking on, but should know by heart at this point.
Anna Lacey.
I'm sorry?
Anna is one of them. Anna Lacey.
Yeah, the great Anna Lacey and company, who adapted the work that is in Psyche, Forson Williams' chapter about some of the sort of material culture around food, and found some of the menus and boarding houses, and you can learn all about the kind of city of Philadelphia. Yeah, thank you. So I think there's a lot more to be had there. One of the ways that we actually first started to track some of the mentions of women would be that they were oftentimes the ones who were figuring out how to pay for the conventions. And they were the ones who would hold the auxiliary meetings afterwards, who would, we would see the sort of list of so-and-so donates $1, so-and-so donates $1, and then the ladies of Harrisburg donate $25, way more than everybody else. And it draws our attention to a couple of places where the food and kind of social life of the conventions. I mean, I think we all know, when we go to conferences, the sessions might be interesting, but that's not really where all the best conversations happen. They happen in the hallway and over dinner or over drinks, standing in a Sheraton in the middle of nowhere, right? All of which seems very sort of foreign, unfamiliar now. Thank you. Yeah, we see some of the, I think it's on the shared screen, some of the exhibit there. Towards the latter end of the century, one of the changes that we see, and maybe I should pass the mic because some of this is Gabrielle's work really calling our attention to, the kind of prominent families who especially move to Washington, D.C., who become extraordinarily wealthy and sort of help put together some of that kind of D.C. high society that Douglas and his family, the Beamans, the Downings, the Shad family is there in lots of different ways, who are really sort of living elegant lifestyles, who are holding salons, who are part of, sort of social life at their giant mansions up in and around DC. And those, I think, really form a core part of the sort of latter end of the conventions that really changes it from being in a one-room church in the middle of nowhere in Indiana somewhere or in upstate New York to much more kind of grand affairs that have sort of full production and coverage. All of which is, maybe Gabrielle can add a little bit more there about some of those families, because I think they can help open up some of these questions about food too.
I just want to say a little bit about foodways. And again, this is Psyche Forson Williams. They're quite amazing students who found more of the advertisements. And to think through your Dr. Here, is that right? Yeah. The question that you asked first, or what you suggested first. So I just want to say, why does this volume forward and advance these kinds of questions? And it's because we put an RFP out that foregrounded women's labor, women's expertise, women's work, because we had the MOU that Jim suggested earlier that said that anybody who was a North American teaching partner with us needed to include women in the work that they were doing. Because we have a principle, we've got a set of principles that we haven't talked about today as a project that says that women's labor needs to be named, that women's expertise needs to be explored. So we hold ourselves accountable to those principles, at least we do our best to. That's what that's what principles are, because obviously you'll fall short all the time, otherwise we wouldn't need them. And so Psyche Forson Williams, Psyche Williams Forson, looked at this and she said, I wonder if this is gonna fit into this volume, right? Like if this essay is going to fit into this volume. We've had lots of questions because it's become one of the most groundbreaking of the essays about the fact that she almost didn't submit it, right? So this kind of question about how do we create the frameworks? How do we reach out the kinds of scholars that we want? How do we build series, right? How do we publish in series? How do we create journals? Right now, I'm talking right to Jessica and Alex and all the other people who are in the room here. How do we build in ways that will encourage and create that which we want to see, right? Becomes the real question to me that your question elicits. And I want to say too, as an opportunity to do one of those clean pivots, that James McCune Smith in the 1847 convention talks about creating a printing house. And he says that we need it with copious resources, full and complete establishments wholly controlled by Black men. Let the thinking, writing man, the compositions, the pressmen, the printers help, yes, all, and he does repeat that word. He says all of them be men of color. Let the work be edited and printed by colored men. And I just want to say again that it seems to me that it's deeply important for us to think through the structures that we want to create and the ways in which the choices we make and the moments we stay silent lead to power replicating itself. And I mean that specifically around racial power and gendered power, right? So that unless we make and articulate interventions, we are not going to see differences. And I know we do this a lot in our scholarship. And I guess the conventions and the scholarship that comes out of it calls for us to do it in committee meetings, in our work lives, in our RFPs, right? Like not just in places that are safe and rewarded.
Hi, Jessica has her hand raised. That's what happened.
That was quick. Well, okay, I guess I could ask my question, but before I do that, I want to, there's a comment in the chat from Marc Rudenet. For anyone interested in the color conventions movement as it played out in New Orleans, feel free to contact me. The New Orleans Tribune, America's first Black daily newspaper, helped organize the movement in Louisiana. The newspaper is a rich source because it covered not only the National Color Convention, October 1864, but also the local color convention that occurred in New Orleans in January of 1865. And I won't say his email address for YouTube because that seems like a lot, but it is there in the chat. And I know that Mark is on Facebook as well, so you can also check that out. I didn't know if, that's not my question, but I didn't know if Gabrielle or Jim wanted to respond to that in the place of New Orleans in the convention movement at all.
Boy, there's so much more work to be done there. There's also a national convention in '72 that we are also hugely indebted to those newspapers for our knowledge of. Including one of the funnier episodes in any of the convention's coverage, when Douglas is 6 days late to a convention, and so they add a day and everybody sticks around till Monday. And there's newspaper reports every day of somebody who's like, I saw Douglas in Tennessee, I saw him in Arkansas, he's definitely coming tomorrow. And then somebody the next day will say, and he's definitely coming tomorrow. And it's fascinating kind of coverage of a real kind of celebrity arriving into town. But yeah, there's so much more history to be had. Certainly with PBH Pinchback, and all of the elected officials in Louisiana who are deeply enmeshed in the conventions and sometimes even hold, don't quote me on the year, one of the conventions at the state level happens directly before the state Republican convention as a part of a sort of planning strategy. And there's all kinds that we can learn about from those parts of the history.
I want to quote from the New Orleans Tribune in January 1865. It's the inaugural Southern Convention, besides the Baltimore Convention that happens before the Civil War, where delegates have to actually flee because of the violence. And that's the only antebellum convention that is held in slaveholding states. And New Orleans, by 65 at this point, has been liberated. And the New Orleans Tribune is the meeting's official organ. And they report that at the convention, quote, "We're seated side by side, the rich and the poor, the literate and the educated man, and the country laborer, hardly released from bondage, distinguished only by the natural gifts of the mind. They're the rich landowner, the opulent tradesman, seconded motions offered by humble mechanics and freemen, ministers of the gospel, officers and soldiers of the US Army, men who handled the sword or the pen, merchants and clerks. All the classes of society were represented and united in a common thought, the actual liberation from social and political bondage." And the paper then announces that the day of the meeting of this convention has inaugurated a new era and understood and underscored that it was the first political move ever made by the colored people of the state acting in a body. And they're not only speaking for Louisiana, again, in terms of political conventions, but for the whole South. And I'd be really interested in people in this room. There's so much expertise in this room, including, obviously, Jessica, who is married to New Orleans, she sometimes says, and Mark and and other people like Susanna Ashton to talk about conventions in New Orleans or South Carolina, for example, if they'd like. I'm always eager to be in a real room, and here we are in our squares. So.
I will let others respond to that, especially folks. I don't know if Mark is able to go on video.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I can comment briefly. As I mentioned in the chat, the New Orleans Tribune was America's first Black daily. It became a daily in October of 1864, which is the same month that the National Color Convention was held in Syracuse, New York. And the Tribune sent two allies to that convention, the most notable individual being Captain James Ingraham. Captain Ingraham fought at the Battle of Port Hudson. He was a member of the 1st Louisiana Native Guard, part of the 1st Louisiana Native Guard were the first colored troops, the first Black troops to see action during the Civil War. And Ingraham brought the battle flag, the blood-stained battle flag, to the National Convention and made a stirring speech in October of 1864. The convention tasked all the delegates to go back to their states and form local branches of the National Equal Rights League. And that's exactly what happened in New Orleans. Ingraham came back with a fellow delegate. They met with the Tribune and they organized a color convention in New Orleans that took place during the first 2 weeks of January of 1865. And that convention formed a local branch of the National Equal Rights League, which was the very beginning of the voting rights movement in Louisiana. And that National Equal Rights League was very powerful in New Orleans. It involved many different organizations within the Black community, and it resulted in the fall of 1865 in the first elections in which Black men were able to vote. It was a mock election. Legally, Black men were not allowed to vote, but they went ahead and did all the organizing, set up voter registration, and turned out 18,000 voters in an election in September of 1865. So it gives you an idea of how powerful the color convention movement was. The seed was planted in Syracuse in 1864. And then we have less than a year later, actual elections happening in Louisiana. So I just wanted to share those historical tidbits. And yeah, New Orleans Tribune, check it out.
One reason why the local settings and context become so important in these national, that emerge from these national news. And the ways in which his comments also highlight for us that we don't yet know what we're calling a convention, right? So there are Black conventions that are called color conventions, but the equal rights conventions, right, are the same people, the same structure. The equal rights leagues, right, conventions are the same structures, the same, literally the formal structures, the formal calls, the conventions of the conventions tie them one to another. And then in the South, in these huge uptick of meetings, as 4 million politically active, desiring, dignified people that belong to Black communities are free from bondage. This kind of uptick means that we have mechanics meetings and teachers educational association meetings and conventions of newspapermen. And you see the kinds of links between the national and the state conventions that continue and the tributaries that are building from them. So figuring out the kind of questions of categorization, of taxonomy, of the influence of network of circuit, all of that are questions that have been stymied in some ways because of structures of ignoring Black-led activism that leads us to be having this conversation in 2021 and not much earlier. Obviously, historians have been having these conversations in chapters of their books. They've been drawing on the convention minutes on these dog-eared volumes by that I guess we can hold up by Howard Holden Bell and by Philip Foner and George. Oh, why am I forgetting his last name? And George Walker. But that went for up to $3,000. But we haven't been talking about them together as a unit and being able to ask some of these questions that emerge when we talk about the national in relationship to the state. And the larger kind of data points until we've had them all in one place and freely accessible, and the ability to think about them in a collection of volumes that raise new questions.
Yeah, I think a couple of places to point to in the book for folks who are interested are the conventions where people would stand up and say, here are the things that we are not going to talk about. I love Dr. Cheryl LaRoche's essay in this book, where she basically makes the argument that there were hundreds of people working on to help people who were trying to emancipate themselves. And the word Underground Railroad, I think, appears once in a joke in thousands of pages of antebellum conventions. And it's of course not that they weren't completely sort of integrated, interrelated in all kinds of different ways. But the argument she makes is that they would go to the convention and talk about things like school and voting rights and so on and so forth. And then afterwards, when they weren't on a stage, then they would talk about those sorts of things. The Reconstruction equivalent, and I love also the chapter by Dr. Thibodeau and Ramey Berry, because they trace a bunch of people in Texas who stand up and say, we are not here to talk about politics. All we want to talk about is voting rights, access to land, funding for education, and freedom and safety from the state. But we're not going to talk about politics. And it's funny to read now, but it's a really sort of careful move on their part and a great reminder about how sort of careful each and every one of these sort of contexts were about how their conventions were representing themselves. And so as Gabrielle was mentioning, I mean, if you really want to come and start a hot mess at one of our meetings, come and ask any one of us what we think a convention is. There's no settled answer. We've been debating this now for what, 9 years, 10 years, and I don't feel like we're any closer to an answer, in part because during the Reconstruction period, especially as there's state and sort of collective racial violence filling the newspapers every day, people stop having colored conventions in so many words and start having meetings of the teachers or the farmers, the mechanics, or the Galilean fishermen, or the sailors of Charleston and Baltimore, and get sort of parceled off in different kinds of ways, doing the same things, using the same format, talking about the same subjects, right? The teachers are talking about agriculture and land rights and voting rights just as much as the mechanics are or the fishermen are. And it's in part because they're trying to sort of develop and evolve a movement and a kind of organizing approach into ways that are going to be able to approach things in different kinds of ways, just because in Tennessee, let's say in the early 1870s, they're facing a different set of problems than they might have been in the 1850s in Ohio. And that, I think sort of points to one of the biggest sort of largest theses behind this entire book that I don't even know that we say out loud enough, which is that this was an incredibly sort of heterogeneous movement, that every sort of chapter and component and era and meeting that we find is always sort of bringing us new parts. It's, I think, an impossible task and a useless one to try and flatten this all into sort of one collective larger sort of body, as much to think about the ways that there's kind of an organic sort of branching out in so many different directions as people sort of grow and develop as activists and leaders in different parts of the country and into Canada, which we should talk about too. And the Caribbean. Sorry, as a very last thing, there's a bunch of people who play important roles in the conventions for decades and then move to the Caribbean, and then our sort of scholarship trails off. And there's just no way that that's the end of the story for people like Samuel Ringgold Ward, Hezekiah Grice, so many other people who moved to Haiti, Jamaica, and beyond. There's so much of that work to be done left.
I think Lorgia Peña is actually doing work on Douglas in Haiti, but I imagine she's going to touch on this. Jessica, you want to ask LB's question, or LB, you want to ask it, and then if we have time, I'll ask mine, and if not, that's okay too, because I'm sure we'll see each other again. Jessica?
LB, do you want to jump in?
Oh, I had put that in the chat because Professor Foreman had was kind of talking about it, but how did it come to be that that until the project, this wasn't major knowledge?
So first, I just want to say hi, LB. I see you, all kinds of in different places. So I just want to say hello. It's nice to see your actual face. This is the question I think hundreds and lots of people are asking. This question gets asked all the time, and I'm almost. There's lots of conventional answers, which at least feel conventional to me. They boil down to sort of questions of America's romance with interracial buddy stories, and the fact that the archives are built around white supremacy, so that that the documents that have been kept have largely been kept in relationship to people who are connected to folks that social historians actually had to resurrect as heroes of democracy, right? It's not like abolitionists were always, and Anna would have more to say about this than anyone else here, or as much to say about this as anyone else here, right? But so part of it is that. Part of it is that this was a movement that was decentralized, that it took place all over North America, that Ohio has more antebellum conventions than any other place. Texas has more than in the postbellum period than many other places. We don't really know yet. We'll know more. Iowa, it turns out, from the work of Leslie Schlom and her class, had 8 conventions, but we only knew about 2 when we started, right? So there's so much, again, that we don't actually know. But some of it is the decentralized nature connected with the fact that folks aren't archiving Black papers, the fact that Black newspapers and ephemera are hard to keep, that full runs of newspapers haven't been digitized, right? So all of that has to informs the reason we don't know. But we also, I think, what resonates for me, in addition to all of those reasons, is that people don't like to produce histories that don't have white folks at their center until recently, right? And that Alex is over there laughing, that's just, that's what it is. And so that's part of it. I also liked Richard's question, so I just wanted to acknowledge it there and to say real quickly that there is a great essay by Denise Berger about Francis Harper's participation in the Delaware Convention. He asked a question about how women influenced as delegates or as speakers. I think he might not have added that, the political citizenship, questions of political citizenship. So Francis Harper shows up in the Delaware Convention. I walk into the Delaware Historical Society and the curator hands it to me and says, "Have you ever seen this?" I say, "No." We open it up, and there Francis Harper is a major speaker, right? Like the most prolific novelist, right, out of the 19th century, the most popular poet, one of the founders of NACW, like Francis Harper, right, is sitting up here in this 72, 73 convention. And it turns out that the research of Denise Berger shows that that Black women in Delaware used her being there in order to organize for educational rights, which is the subject of the convention itself. And so they used her presence, right, in order to get much more attention. And they launched a two-year campaign that turns in to actual real and measurable improvements around education. Now, of course, those get deteriorated because Delaware does not have a public high school outside of Wilmington. There's only one public high school in Wilmington until until the 1950s. So if you lived anywhere else in the state, you either had to pay to go to school, to high school, or send your children away to a different city in the 1950s, right? But they're doing that activism and getting some success in the 1870s because of and using strategically Francis Harper's work. So again, Denise Berger and Legacy Magazine, Legacy Journal. Sorry to sneak that in, Jessica and Alex.
No problem. My question is big, and I'm gonna ask you to answer within, if possible, within 5 or 6 minutes. But it's the kind of question that I think we should have just a meeting about that question. And the question is a question that me and Jessica and others have been thinking about. And I think it's a question for which you will have a very unique answer based on your experience over the years in building this massive collective and in facilitating a collectivity of people that have produced both great digital pedagogical work and this volume. And the question is, who owns Black data in the 21st century? And one way to approach it, to approach the question is, of course, to notice that, for example, when you're introducing the project, you talk about both on the digital project and in the book itself, you talk about how some of the collections are coming from paid sources, like Gale. You acknowledge Gale allows you to use some collections, and then some of them come from small libraries, small archives. Some of the materials you digitize yourself, some of the materials were digitized by others. But you start seeing kind of this sort of the broken record kind of hiding everything that needs to be recovered by its very brokenness. And the work of recovery, in a very real sense, is the work of building thematic archives, compiling thematic archives. So the thematic archive actually will always stand in contrast to libraries and archives, who supposedly collect expansively, right? And you've experienced this. And the idea then is, though, how do we move towards a world in which we can begin to consider the patrimony of Black folks in this country, if we could call it that, matrimony of Black folks in this country, as part of a movement towards reparation in which that data can go to Black hands, rather than existing in all these places in which I know the profession, and the profession is mostly white. And white people control both private industry and in nonprofits. That's the question. It's a big question. Take it away.
Now
She's pointing at you, Jim.
Now Gabrielle wants to pass the mic. That's a great question, and one that I wish a lot of folks who are in this space could also speak to right now. Maybe one way of starting the conversation is to talk about the ways that we're trying to solve for this question. We're trying to sort of figure out how to have these conversations. Gabrielle, you have to help me out. You know, if my memory's going, we're in bad shape. The woman who wrote the article in the Atlantic about, if I had a Google search, about the manuscripts and archives and scrapbooks that are being housed and kept at HBCU archives and that are being safeguarded, let's put about 1 million quotes around that, at predominantly white institutions. There's real kind of material questions, right? There's sort of larger abstract questions. Data is kind of easier to move than physical materials, but I think the conversation might have to start around some of those questions. And those answers are not, you know, kicking a few grants here and there. I think those are larger structural questions that that I think make me think, Alex, that that's a frankly revolutionary sort of question to ask, because it means that we're going to have to unmake a lot of these institutions the way that they exist right now. I mean, just fundamentally. That answer, I think, is going to fall to wiser people than me. One of the ways that we're starting to try and think about reversing at least some of the directions that resources tend to flow. We're at this brand new center. There's a lot of us here working together. And one of the things that we're thinking about is how we can use some of the know-how that are incredibly talented, hardworking, thank you, Dr. Cynthia Greenlee. Go check out her piece in the Atlantic Monthly from a couple of months back about William Dorsey's scrapbooks. We're trying to think more about how we can contribute to the larger field community around building projects that are going to sort of be inviting spaces or that go into other people's spaces. Crowdsourcing transcription is not the answer. It just isn't. It's an imperfect answer, but it's, I think, one that's helping to develop our sort of process internally where we're thinking about how do we bring materials to people where we're not showing up and saying, okay, we want to now remake the People's University. And we need now to recreate huge amounts of infrastructure and resources. I think oftentimes what's now getting coded as public humanities and all that sort of weird stuff is reliant on basically building a branch of our universities, you know, in some place where they have not existed before, and put the logo up and all that kind of stuff. We're trying to think about the ways that inviting people to come hang out with us for a day and have some birthday cake on February 14th for Douglas Day might create the kind of space where those conversations might change a little bit. Because I think we're not even there yet to having a lot of those conversations in serious ways because there's trust issues. Not a lot of our universities have really earned that trust, I think, in significant ways. And so when we go out and want to have some of these conversations, that's the legacy that even if we not, you know, us ourselves are directly embodying, that's, you know, still a part of the work that we're doing. And so figuring out how to at least create some of those spaces, I think, is a lot of the sort of agenda for us for the next couple of years. But I also shouldn't talk too long because usually Gabrielle and I go and talk about all these things. And of course, she has so many things to say on this particular question.
I mean, this is such a large question about capitalism and the crevices of capitalism, right? Or the crevices in which we fight privatization, erasure, but also the places where we celebrate our survival and the strategies for survival that we've always had, right? So we've always had griots in our community. We've always had cultural artists in our community. We've always had celebration and wholeness and some kind of, I don't even want to take those words back. But we've always had cultural artists who function as historians in our communities, and we've always had institutions in our communities that are operating in the crevices of capitalism and privatization and late stage capitalism, right, as well. So I think my question, you know, one of the answers, and I'd really actually love to hear what these, I'd like to be a fly in the wall in these discussions, actually, Alex, I bet you can make that happen, is, you know, about some of the kind of work that you guys do, right? Like, so how do we get collectives to do work in the moment, that are fast responders around metadata, around activist interventions in the digital? How do we create skirmishes and win skirmishes, I should say, not create them, but win them, or work with people who have some reason to be allies with us? How do we create structures and push funders to ask for accountability, which is working certainly with the master's tools, to have them write into their funding guidelines ways to be accountable to communities? How do we build resources that are actually equitable so that the funding doesn't go to big places, to named institutions, but that it can move through to community archiving? How do we bring brilliant people and thinkers like Marissa Parham into the room to think through questions of who owns servers, right? You know, and where we actually publish, and where we keep our documents, and how we save them, and then how do we deal with the larger questions about, you know, which are environmental in some ways, about fires, about floods, right, that are taking places out, right? Like right now with the Whitney Plantation, for example, right? Like, how do we deal with these larger questions of capitalism that are literally ruining the planet and not allowing us to store data, right? Like, and store our history, preserve our history. So I don't know that when you talk about large questions, you ain't lying. I mean, you know, like, but I suspect that the answers and the questions that you and Jessica and Marissa and Anna are raising are much more stimulating than the ones that we just gave. And And I'd love to be a fly on the wall for some of those.
Thank you for closing us on that, for the vote of confidence, and for closing us on that note that reminds us all that the conventions continue in our own day, in their own way. And thank you for joining us today to discuss your book. And I am so sorry that we have to come to an end. It's already 6:31. Please, if you haven't gotten it yet, you can go to our site and find the link to it, but also you can just Google it and you'll find this is a phenomenal volume. Like LB said, this is like, why didn't we know about this before type book? All right, and let me announce really quick before we depart, our next reading, which is, in a sense, it's unique in the way that it actually is going to bring us to the present and the persistence of slavery, in particular in the economic history of slavery, of child trafficking in Nigeria. Now, I don't know if Jessica's sharing the link to our site and schedule on the chat, but our next meeting will be September 8th, Wednesday at 5 p.m. and we hope to see you there. So thank you all for joining us today, and we will see you at the next one. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Gabrielle.